If you want to support the channel on Patreon and other forms of social media, links are in the description below. There is in all things a pattern that is part of our universe. It has symmetry, elegance, and grace. These qualities you find always in that the true artist captures. You can find it in the turning of the seasons, the way sand trails along a ridge, in the branch clusters of the creosote bush of the pattern of its leaves. We try to copy these patterns in our lives and in our society, seeking the rhythms, the dances, the forms that comfort. Yet, it is possible to see peril in the finding of ultimate perfection. It is clear that the ultimate pattern contains its own fixity. In such perfection, all things move towards death. Frank Herbert's 1965 book, Dune, is one of the pillars of science fiction. Not only is it the best-selling sci-fi book of all time, the novel itself is an epic. 412 pages of political machinations, intrigue and personal battles amongst interstellar houses. Operatic space battles may be one thing, but Dune is almost like Gibbon's Fall of the Roman Empire, only in space, endlessly quotable with lines that could have almost come from the art of war. Its influence on the genre, on media itself, is huge, a monolith. And for years in the wake of its success, people struggled with an almost equally epic task, adapting this incredible story to other forms of media. Many attempts were aborted, or simply fell short of the mark, until finally someone decided to make a video game. Dune is one of the first examples of an adaptation, a licensed game even, that succeeded where all other attempts had failed in making a huge world into a reality, and for that it deserves recognition. Before that though, a pocket history of failure. Why is Dune so difficult to adapt? Well, where do you start? At its absolute base, the book is a story of one man, Paul Atreides, his life and his ascension. The houses of Atreides and Harkonnen fight on this one planet, Arrakis, that so happens to contain the most valuable commodity in the universe, spice. The original inhabitants of the planet, the Freemen, are their own faction. These simple events expand into many themes: ecology, environmentalism, and the collapse of empires, just to name a handful. You're almost spoilt for choice with Dune, but really, you either have everything or nothing. Which is why the original attempts to adapt Dune into a film proved to be such a great challenge. The first shot, in 1971, wanted an epic director for an epic book. David Lean, he of Lawrence of Arabia, Bridge on the River Kwai, and all sorts. A man for epics, and certainly not a man known for science fiction. But perhaps that is appropriate, considering the sort of work that Dune is. But in any case, he turned it down. The project never managed to find a director, and when the man who purchased the rights, Arthur P. Jacobs, died in 1973, this first attempt died with him. The second was the biggest of the failed attempts. In 1974, a French consortium purchased the rights, and the man they chose to direct the film? This guy, Alejandro Jodorowsky, one of the great legends of cult, surrealistic cinema, a man who, like Lean, also makes epics. But his are unlike any other. Even in the director-driven film culture of the 1970s, where studios basically threw money at people just to let them make whatever they wanted, the Chilean mastermind was a thoroughly non-commercial outlier. In short, if you're familiar with Werner Herzog, as a lot of people are these days, well, Jodorowsky could almost be considered Herzog's even crazier father. He's still kicking and very much active now, even as he approaches the age of 90. A great choice to direct Dune then. The Jodorowsky Dune had lots of people on board, including many legends: Orson Welles, Gloria Swanson, Mick Jagger, Alain Delon, a soundtrack to be provided by Pink Floyd, and a role for surrealist painter Salvador Dali as Emperor Shaddam IV, who demanded $100,000 per hour. Jodorowsky agreed, and promptly shortened his part so that it could be filmed in precisely 1 hour. That's how he solves such problems. Aside from overpaid prima donnas, another thing that Jodorowsky doesn't much care for is editing his scripts down. He immediately planned for Dune to be a 10-hour movie. Yes, 10. And by the time that his script was actually finished, it was set to be 14 hours long. There are long films, of course, and hey, I'm not against long movies, I've spent 5 hours watching Andrei Rublev, which is about a bunch of medieval Russians casting a bell, and I regret nothing. But I do draw the line at films that should come with a warning that if you watch the whole thing in one sitting, you may give yourself a DVT. Jodorowsky's Dune wasn't set to be a straight adaptation either. He intended to recreate Herbert's story and recast it in his own psychosomatic yet utterly teetotal vision. Not that he didn't have a great respect for Herbert and his work, you understand, but if you get Jodorowsky, you let Jodorowsky do what he wants. You understand that he does not care one iota about commercialism and making money. You're simply along for the ride. At least until the money runs out, which eventually it did. $2 million had been spent in pre-production, and there wasn't going to be enough backing to actually shoot the damned thing. And so Jodorowsky's Dune fell by the wayside, despite the Herculean efforts of many to get this cinematic spruce goose flying. It's a great story. There's a documentary all about Jodorowsky's Dune, and it is recommended viewing. In 1976, the rights fall to someone perhaps more experienced with making films commercial as well as critical successes, Dino De Laurentiis. A new émigré to American soul, having made his name as a producer in Italian cinema, albeit one with plenty of well-acclaimed hits under his belt, Dino gets Frank Herbert himself to write a script which would then be further distilled by Rudi Wurlitzer, and his choice for director in 1979 is Ridley Scott, fresh off the success of Alien. Scott's vision was for 2 movies based on the script, and he was drafting well. However, he dropped out 7 months in due to the death of his elder brother, and soon after he moves on to another sci-fi film, ultimately a 1982 effort that, at the time, didn't exactly set the box office on fire. Blade Runner, it's called. In any case, another Dune adaptation fails. Finally, at the 4th time of asking, Dino's second attempt in 1981 finally produces something. After his daughter Raffaella sees The Elephant Man, Dino is convinced to bring David Lynch on board, who proceeds to devise a script first as part of a trio, and ultimately on his own. Finally, the cameras start rolling on a Dune film in 1983, and after a great amount of cutting we have a film just over 2 hours long hitting the cinema in December of '84, starring Carl McLachlan as Paul Atreides, along with luminaries such as Max von Sydow, Dean Stockwell, and of course, Stin. The film bombs both at the box office and in front of the critics, who almost all lambast it. Why did this film fail so? It is often regarded as a film that's utterly confused and impenetrable, especially for a big-budget Hollywood sci-fi flick. It clearly has the marks of being pulled from one direction to another. The almost medical, cold camera work, lack of emotion, and occasional moments of squick that you often associate with a David Lynch film is certainly there. However, for critics at the time, this was considered a negative mark on a film like this. Far too harsh. Several, including Siskel and Ebert, regarded it as their worst film of 1984. Lynch, who famously turned down Return of the Jedi for Dune, Lord knows what that would have been like, has never been happy with the film, to the point where he's one of the highest profile directors to invoke an Alan Smithy credit, which he did for the 2-part made-for-TV edit of the film. Jodorowsky took great persuasion to see this version of the film, but once dragged there he gradually became more relieved as the film played out, because it had not succeeded. However, the film did have one supporter. Frank Herbert was happy with the adaptation, and believed that it was true to his original work. He, at least, was pleased with it. That's the history of failed and badly received film adaptations of Dune anyway. At least that's the history of it before the video game. It is possible to say more after. There have been other attempts at adapting Dune from this century, and there still continue to be attempts. So far, none of them have started shooting. This is a real beast of a book, and many consider it to be unadaptable to film, cursed almost. Eventually, as far as visual mediums go, it fell to the Sci-Fi Channel to make a mini-series based on Dune in 2000 that was actually received quite well, the episodic television format being a much more comfortable fit for Herbert's book. Harnessing it all into a film adaptation, however, still yet to be done. However, while Lynch's 1984 attempt was a failure, it would eventually be integral to the development of the most successful adaptation to date, the computer game. Frank Herbert, having seen his work brought to the screen, pleased with it though no one else was, dies in 1986. Thanks in particular to Dune and several other box office turkeys, Dino De Laurentiis' production company went bankrupt in 1988, leaving the rights to adaptations of the work in limbo. However, the problem would be solved by Martin Alper of Virgin Interactive, who secured the rights from Universal in 1990. He would entrust the game to a nascent team that represented the embers of the recently deceased French games company Eri Informatique, led by Philippe Ulrich. This company would later be known as Cryo Interactive, and the main reason they landed the job was their strange, almost unclassifiable and well-received 1988 sci-fi game, Captain Blood. The production of the Dune game, set to be a mixture of adventure and strategy, was quite fraught thanks to various changes in Virgin's structure that, at times, left the project in a state of limbo. At one point, Alper pulled out and gave the game to Westwood Interactive, which would become important later on. However, Cryo was still getting funding to make their game. Sega got involved in 1991 when they bought Virgin's European operations, something that could have killed the game then and there, but they were interested in it even though they didn't have the rights, and ultimately they would land the game for the Mega CD. A last-ditch meeting between Cryo and Virgin, represented by Alper, saves the project when they're impressed by the work that Cryo has done. Eventually, all's well that ends well, because Virgin end up with not one, but two successful Dune games on their hands, because the Westwood project didn't stop either. And so, strangely, both Cryo's game and Westwood's, Dune 2 The Battle for Arrakis, are released in 1992. Westwood's game, most famous on the PC, is a highly important one that's considered a groundbreaking release in the nascent real-time strategy genre, a distillation of the war between Atreides and Harkonnen into pitched battles, potent cocktails of lightning-quick resource management, troop formation, and ultimately the great fight itself. It would be Westwood's first step towards greatness in the genre. Cryo's game, however, is an altogether different proposition, and it is the one that we will be mostly looking at today. As I often do, I'm focusing on the version that I know best, which is the Amiga. So, Cryo's Dune. It's a heady mix of genres. You've got RPG, you've got adventure, you've got strategy. It seems to be a hard game to pin down, but it is something of a game of its time. I think that perhaps the best way to describe it is as one of the best realised multimedia games. There's a good reason why the game got ported to the likes of the Mega CD and shone very brightly on there. The gameplay elements are actually all quite light. Just for one example, the resource management and what have you isn't as in-depth as, say, a K240 or something like that, but it's enough that the game can succeed on any platform, and it plays well when mixed with everything else. As Paul Atreides, you are free to explore these lands at your leisure a lot of the time, although helpfully your next goals are often quite signposted. You will have several people on hand to help you out at any given time with conversation and directions, although you can't always just direct your ornithopter to an immediately obvious location. You often have to be aware of where you're flying, and sometimes it pays to just go out yourself, so long as you have your still suit on hand and you're ready to face any sandworms you may find. The overarching goal is simple. To control Arrakis, you must produce spice. You find seachers, get the free men to work for you, prospect the land, and give them harvesters and the like to maximise production. Once these men are loyal enough, they will also fight for you. Eventually you will have enough men to head north and take on the Harkonnen. And of course you have the general story of Dune itself, which is very well tested by this point. The game conveys the story well, and manages to get across its grandiosity. This is especially well realised in the CD versions of the game, which feature a good deal of excellent voice acting, again making this a very well done multimedia game. You have the well-drawn portraits, the day and night cycles, the ever-changing face of Paul as the spice works its magic, the black in his eyes giving away to blue, and the simple sight of your Orny flying across a barren wasteland in search of those precious seafs. Even if the Amiga version that I have here lacks the speech of the CD versions, the story is still very well communicated. The character design is something else, even if some, notably Stin, still retain the appearance they had in the David Lynch movie, there are lots of other original designs. Also, there's lots of ways to explore the game's lore, a chance to have a full look at the planet itself and see the scope of the task that awaits you, or to go through a journal where, as in games like Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, a huge chunk of the narrative can be realised with a simple quote. The prose may not be as expansive as the book, but it's still very well written indeed. and as a result these barren wastelands feel like home, especially when you stray too far into the Harkonnens' territory or fall foul of a sandworm, and watch as Paul becomes an unfortunate part of that wasteland. It's always memorable when you reload a save and Paul is made whole again, mind you. The story is definitely enough to make this game stick with you. Good thing too, as Dune is pretty damn long. Even an experienced person's playthrough is going to take a good few hours from beginning to end. It is certainly the sort of game you can play in chunks though, especially nowadays. You always end up going back to the palace to recuperate and figure out where you need to go next, and that's always a good spot to close a chapter, so to speak. Or rather make a save state if you're on an emulator and otherwise unromantic. And you can also happily zone out while playing this game to the awesome graphics for the time and the utterly superb soundtrack, one of the best you'll find in any Amiga game without a shadow of a doubt. Granted, there's not a lot of it, but they are 3 of the most memorable Amiga tunes of all time. Despite all the troubles that people had trying to get an epic like Dune into a film, it turned out that for video games, it was no problem at all. The somewhat episodic nature of it translates very well into an adventure like this one, where the gameplay changes just enough to keep it flowing, and the story is always going to have its hooks in you due to the many memorable characters and all the lore it keeps throwing your way. The second game is perhaps better remembered these days, especially when you consider how influential it was in the RTS genre. It concentrates more on battles, and in that regard it's obviously more in-depth than Cryo's game could ever hope to be. But if you want something a bit more chilling, where you can really get into the story and all of its facets, well, the first game might just be the thing. In the end, they're both still talked about, and they show the capability that games had. Not that there hadn't been any in-depth games before Dune, far from it, but still, it was certainly a surprise to those who still thought only about beeping spaceships and overly athletic plumbers. Bye for now. The community gives thanks to the following: Adam Schaefer, Alex Stocco, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sawley, Conformist, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Guatham Blackmore, Hunter, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Johnston, Martin Pataki, Morten Skanin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albin, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Scott Coulter, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, Leon Natural, Tanyo J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.